And now she stood there, trembling before the altar, about to become the wife of a man who would not even look into her eyes. Josephine Cooper clutched the simple bouquet of wildflowers between her fingers, feeling the weight of the borrowed dress and the situation that had brought her to this moment. How had a 22-year-old young woman who had never even kissed someone ended up in this luxurious church in downtown Colorado Springs, promising to love and honor a stranger? The answer sat just a few meters away, in a discreet wheelchair in the corner of the church. Her mother, Margaret Cooper, who smiled with tears in her eyes, finally relieved. The experimental treatment that would cost a fortune was now guaranteed, but the price had been her daughter. "Do you take Frank Dixon as your lawful wedded husband?" The minister's voice echoed in the silent environment, where only a few guests witnessed this ceremony that resembled more of a business deal being closed. Josephine raised her eyes for the first time to the man beside her. Frank Dixon, at 35 years old, was even more imposing up close. Impeccable suits, dark hair perfectly styled, square jawline and grey eyes that seemed to calculate every movement. He was the type of man who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals before breakfast, so accepting this arranged marriage orchestrated by his father was just another transaction on his agenda. "I do," murmured Josephine, her voice barely a whisper. Frank repeated the words with the same coldness with which he signed contracts. There was no kiss at the altar, just a formal handshake that sealed the agreement. 3 months earlier, Josephine never could have imagined being in this situation. She lived peacefully in the small town of Woodland Park in the Colorado mountains, caring for her sick mother and working as a general assistant at one of the branches of Dixon Real Estate Development. Her routine was simple. Wake up early, feed Scout and Daisy, her 2 mixed-breed dogs, prepare breakfast, take care of the house, work at the company, return home, read some of the books she had inherited from her deceased father, and repeat everything the next day. But then her mother collapsed during Sunday service, and the diagnosis changed everything. Advanced stage cancer, with chances of cure only through an expensive treatment in Denver. Josephine sold everything she could sell, asked for loans she knew she could never repay, but it still was not enough. That was when Mr. Harold Dixon, Frank's father and owner of the business conglomerate, appeared in her life like a saving angel, or a tempting demon depending on perspective. "You are an exemplary young lady, Josephine," he said during a visit to the company where she worked. "Religious, pure, hard-working. Exactly the type of woman my son needs to settle down and think about starting a family." The proposal was simple. Marry Frank in exchange for complete payment of her mother's treatment, plus a generous allowance and a new house. Josephine would have security, Margaret would have health, and Frank would have a wife who would not complicate his life with unnecessary drama. "But he doesn't know me," protested Josephine, her cheeks blushing. "And I don't know him." "Arranged marriages worked for centuries, my dear," responded Mr. Harold with a paternal smile. "Frank needs stability, not passion. You need security, not romance. It is a perfect agreement." Josephine consulted Emma Thompson, her best friend and only confidant. They had known each other since childhood, and Emma was like an older sister, always ready to give sensible advice. "Josephine, this is madness!" exclaimed Emma, almost dropping her coffee cup when she heard the proposal. "You cannot marry a stranger." "But Mama will die if I don't accept," Josephine murmured, nervously playing with the hem of her dress. "And it's not like I have other options. Who would be interested in me anyway? I've never even dated properly." "Josephine Cooper, stop that right now!" Emma held her friend's hands. "You are beautiful, intelligent, kind. Any man would be lucky to have you." But in the end, love for her mother spoke louder. Josephine accepted the proposal, and 3 weeks later she was walking toward the altar. The honeymoon was a non-existent concept. After the ceremony, Frank took her directly to his mansion in the upscale Broadmoor area, a true modern palace with mountain views. Josephine had never seen so much luxury in one place. Italian marble, crystal chandeliers, artwork that probably cost more than her entire house. "Your quarters are on the second floor," Frank informed her coldly, handing her a key. "Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, will show you everything you need to know. I have a business trip tomorrow and will be away for a week." And so, Josephine found herself alone in a gigantic mansion, married to a man who barely spoke to her, far from everything she knew. That first night she cried herself to sleep, hugging the pillow, feeling lonelier than ever. But Josephine Cooper was not a young woman who gave in easily to despair. The next day, she got up determined to make this situation work, even if Frank seemed like a wall of ice. After all, her mother was receiving the best possible treatment, and that was worth any sacrifice. What she did not know was that Frank Dixon, the man of ice who had closed his heart to love after a devastating betrayal in the past, was about to discover that some people have the power to melt even the most frozen souls, and that sometimes life's best gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. A week later, when Frank returned from his business trip to Denver, he found something he definitely had not expected. His house was different. Not physically, nothing had been moved or altered, but there was something in the air, a soft aroma of cinnamon and vanilla that had never been present before. "Mrs. Henderson," he called, leaving his suitcase in the entrance hall. The housekeeper appeared quickly, and Frank noticed something unusual. She was smiling. Mrs. Henderson, who had worked for him for 5 years, rarely showed emotions beyond professional efficiency. "Welcome back, Mr. Frank," she said, taking his briefcase. "Mrs. Josephine is in the kitchen preparing dinner." "In the kitchen?" Frank frowned. "Why is she in the kitchen? Shouldn't you be taking care of that?" "She insisted, sir. Said she wanted to prepare something special for your return." Mrs. Henderson hesitated a moment before continuing. "If I may observe, sir, the house is more cheerful with her here." Frank did not respond, but headed to the kitchen with slow steps. He had married Josephine expecting her to be a silent and discreet presence in his life, someone who would fulfill social expectations without interfering with his routine. A week's absence should have been enough for her to settle quietly into her new role. Upon reaching the kitchen, he stopped at the entrance. Josephine had her back to him, wearing an apron over a simple light blue dress, humming softly while stirring something on the stove. Her light brown hair was tied in a half-undone bun, with some rebellious strands framing her face. It was a domestic and warm scene. "Good evening," he said, and Josephine turned quickly, almost dropping the spoon she was holding. "Frank!" Her face lit up with a genuine smile that caught him off guard. "You're back! How was the trip?" "You must be starving. I made beef stroganoff. I hope you like it. Mrs. Henderson told me it's one of your favorite dishes, but I used my mother's recipe, which has a special touch of—" "Josephine," he interrupted her, his voice drier than intended. "You don't need to cook. Mrs. Henderson can take care of that." Her smile wavered slightly, but did not disappear completely. "I know I don't need to, but I wanted to. It's the first thing I can offer as your wife, and—" "You are not my wife." The words came out harsher than he intended. "I mean, not in the traditional sense. We are partners in an agreement. You don't need to play the role of devoted wife." This time the smile disappeared completely. Josephine lowered her eyes, her cheeks reddening with embarrassment. "I understand. Forgive me for the presumption." For the rest of dinner, which took place in almost absolute silence, Frank regretted the harshness of his words. The stroganoff was really delicious, seasoned with care he had not tasted in years, but admitting that would be opening a door he preferred to keep locked. In the following days, Josephine seemed to have absorbed the message. She continued polite and gentle, but maintained respectful distance. She greeted him in the morning, wished him good night, and little more. She had found her own routine, waking up early to talk to her mother on the phone, tending to a small garden she had started in the outdoor area, reading in the library, and sometimes talking at length with Mrs. Henderson. Frank should have been satisfied with this dynamic. It was exactly what he had negotiated: discreet company that did not interfere with his life. So why did he feel slightly bothered by the change? The answer came a week later, during the professional development course his company offered to employees. As CEO, Frank made a point of personally supervising the most important trainings, especially those involving leadership and personal development. He was reviewing the participant lists when he saw the name Josephine Cooper Dixon. "Did Mrs. Henderson enroll Josephine in the course?" he asked his assistant Sarah. "Actually, she enrolled herself," Sarah replied, consulting her files. "Said she would like to develop skills to perhaps work at the company. Very proactive of her." Frank was surprised. Josephine had not mentioned interest in working at the company. In fact, she barely talked to him lately. On the first day of the course, he arrived at the training room with his usual posture: impeccable suit, serious expression, presence that commanded immediate attention. The 20 participants stood respectfully when he entered, but his eyes automatically searched for Josephine. She was sitting in the third row, wearing a simple but well-cut business outfit, probably one of the clothes he had ordered bought for her, hair tied in an elegant ponytail. When their eyes met, she offered a polite and professional smile, as if she were just another employee. During the initial presentation, Frank found himself watching her more than he should. Josephine took notes attentively, asked intelligent questions, and interacted naturally with other participants. There was a confidence in her that he had not noticed before, as if being outside the domestic environment brought out a different facet of her personality. "Can someone give me an example of a situation where assertive communication made a difference in your lives?" asked the instructor. Josephine raised her hand. "When my mother got sick, I had to talk to doctors, negotiate treatments, make difficult decisions. I learned that being clear and firm in words, while still being polite, made all the difference in the results." Her voice was soft, but there was an underlying strength in it that Frank had never perceived. She was talking about the period that preceded their marriage, about the challenges she had faced alone before he appeared with his solution. During the break, he saw her talking animatedly with two colleagues, laughing at something one of them had said. It was the first time he had seen her genuinely relaxed since they got married. "She's very nice," commented Robert, one of the managers, approaching Frank. "Didn't know you were married, boss." "She's quite different from what we imagined Frank Dixon's wife would be." "Different how?" asked Frank, trying to sound casual. "I don't know. We expected someone more sophisticated, elite. She's more real, natural. Talks to everyone like they were longtime friends." Frank observed Josephine from across the room. She was listening attentively to a story one of the participants was telling, her expressions showing genuine empathy and interest. It was true. She was real in a way he had forgotten existed. At the end of the first day, Josephine approached him. "Frank, may I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped away from the group. "Yes. I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to participate in the course. I know it must be strange having your wife mixed with the employees." "You don't need my permission for anything, Josephine, and I don't mind that you're here." He hesitated. "Actually, you're doing very well." A shy smile appeared on her face. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." As they walked together to the car, Frank realized something disturbing. For the first time in weeks, he was looking forward to getting home. Not for the solitude and tranquility he usually sought, but for her company. And that terrified him. The second day of the course brought a dynamic that Frank had not anticipated: teamwork. Participants were divided into pairs for a trust and communication exercise, and fate, or perhaps his assistant Sarah, who had organized the pairs, placed Josephine as his partner. "Seriously?" murmured Frank when he saw the list, but Josephine was already approaching with an amused expression. "Looks like we'll have to work together," she said, and there was a mischievous gleam in her eyes that he had never seen before. "I promise to be a good work colleague." The exercise was apparently simple. One partner would be blindfolded and trust the other to guide them through an obstacle course, then they would switch positions. The objective was to develop mutual trust and effective communication. "Who goes first?" asked the instructor. "I can start blindfolded," offered Frank, surprising himself. Josephine tied the blindfold over his eyes carefully, her fingers lightly touching his forehead as she adjusted the fabric. It was the first real physical contact between them since the handshake at the altar, and Frank felt a strange electric current run through his skin. "You can trust me," she murmured, her voice close to his ear. "I won't let you get hurt." And then she began to guide him. Her voice was soft but firm, her instructions precise. 3 steps forward, now lift your right foot, there's a low obstacle. That's it. Perfect. Now turn slightly to the left. There was something hypnotic about the way she led him. Frank, who was accustomed to having absolute control over all situations, discovered that trusting her was surprisingly comforting. "Now the hardest part," said Josephine. "There's a suspended rope in front of you. You need to pass under it, but trust me about the height." Frank hesitated. Without being able to see, he did not know whether he should duck a lot or a little. "Frank." Her voice became softer, almost intimate. "Trust me." He ducked slowly, following her instructions, and felt her hand rest lightly on his back, guiding him. It was not just physical guidance. It was a gesture of genuine care. When they reached the end of the course, Frank removed the blindfold and turned to her. Josephine was smiling, but there was something different in her expression, an intensity that had not been there before. "Now it's my turn," she said, taking the blindfold from his hands. Frank tied the blindfold, more consciously this time of the contact between his fingers and the soft skin of her forehead. Josephine closed her eyes even before the blindfold was in place, a gesture of trust that caught him off guard. Guiding her was a completely different experience. She moved with natural grace, responding to his instructions with confidence that showed she truly trusted him. When they reached a more complex obstacle, he instinctively placed his hand on her waist to guide her better. "Is everything okay?" he asked when he felt her hesitate. "More than okay," she replied, and there was something in her voice that made his heart race. When they finished the exercise, they stood facing each other, closer than they had ever been. Josephine removed the blindfold slowly, blinking to adjust to the light, and when her eyes met his, Frank felt something he had not felt in years, a genuine connection. "Very good, everyone," the instructor's voice broke the moment. "Now let's discuss what you learned about trust and communication." During the group discussion, Josephine was one of the first to speak. "I learned that trusting is not about not being afraid. It's about choosing to believe that the other person won't disappoint you, even when you have no way to be sure." Her words echoed in Frank's mind for the rest of the day. That night, during dinner, there was a subtle change in the dynamics between them. The conversation flowed more naturally. Josephine told funny stories about the other course participants, and Frank found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks. "You have a beautiful laugh," said Josephine suddenly, after telling a particularly funny anecdote about a colleague who got confused during a dynamic. Frank stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. "What?" "Your laugh," she repeated, blushing slightly. "You should laugh more often. You become more human." "Human?" He arched an eyebrow, but there was amusement in his voice. "You know what I mean. Less intimidating CEO, more Frank." It was the first time she had spoken his name so naturally, and he liked the sound. "And you," he said, surprising himself with his own boldness, "have been different since you started the course, more confident." Josephine smiled. Maybe it's because I'm finally doing something I chose to do, not something that was chosen for me. Her observation hit him like a direct arrow. Everything in her life had been decided by circumstances. Caring for her mother, accepting the marriage, living in that house. The course was the first thing she had actively chosen. "Josephine," he said, putting down his fork, "about what I said the first night I returned from the trip. I was unnecessarily rude." She shook her head. "You were just being honest about the nature of our arrangement." "Maybe," he admitted, "but that doesn't justify having spoken that way. You were being kind, and I didn't know how to react to kindness." It was more emotional honesty than Frank had shown in years, and Josephine seemed to recognize the importance of the moment. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "It means a lot." That night, Frank stayed awake for hours, looking at the ceiling of his room. For the first time since the marriage, he found himself thinking about the woman who slept on the other side of the hallway, not as an obligation or bothersome presence, but as Josephine, a real person, with dreams, fears, and a quiet strength he was just beginning to discover. And for the first time in a long time, the prospect of getting to know someone better did not terrify him completely. But some discoveries, he would soon learn, come with unexpected complications. On the third day of the course, Frank arrived at the training room and immediately noticed that something was different. Josephine was sitting in her usual place, but her posture was more rigid, her smile forced, and beside her, occupying a chair that definitely was not on the original participant list, was Victoria Sterling. Victoria, senior attorney in the company's legal department, was a woman Frank respected professionally, but who always made him slightly uncomfortable personally. At 33 years old, she was brilliant, ambitious, and made no secret of her interest in him, interest he had consistently ignored, especially after his marriage. "Frank," Victoria approached during the break, her predatory smile shining as always. "What a surprise to find your wife here. I didn't know she had interest in professional development." There was poorly disguised venom in her words, and Frank immediately went on alert. "Josephine is adapting very well to the corporate environment," he replied, keeping his tone neutral but firm. "I'm sure she is," Victoria laughed, a sound that did not reach her eyes. "It must be fascinating for someone from such a different background. I imagine she's learning a lot about how things work in our world." From across the room, Josephine was talking with other participants, but Frank noticed she was casting occasional glances in their direction, clearly aware of the conversation taking place. During the afternoon session, the instructor proposed a debate exercise on business ethics. Participants were divided into groups to defend different positions on a hypothetical dilemma. A company discovered that one of its main suppliers used child labor, but switching suppliers would result in increased costs and possible employee layoffs. Josephine was in the group defending immediate supplier change, regardless of costs. Victoria, naturally, was in the opposing group. "We need to be realistic," argued Victoria with her usual eloquence. "A company has responsibilities to its employees and shareholders. Decisions based purely on idealism can result in devastating practical consequences." Josephine stood up to rebut, and Frank could see she was nervous, but determined. "Idealism," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "We're talking about children being exploited. How can we call the refusal to be accomplices to this idealism? A company that cannot operate without exploitation should not exist." "What a romantic view," Victoria smiled condescendingly. "But in the real world, dear, things are more complex. Not all of us have the luxury of living in fairy tales where moral decisions have no practical consequences." The patronizing tone and the word "dear" made Frank clench his fists. He saw Josephine blink rapidly. A sign he was learning to recognize indicated she was fighting back tears. But then something extraordinary happened. Josephine straightened her shoulders, raised her chin, and looked directly at Victoria. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice clear and firm. "The real world is complex. I grew up in that real world. I know what it's like to make difficult decisions when all choices are bad. But I also know that when you abdicate your principles for convenience, you don't solve problems. You become part of them." The room fell silent. Josephine continued, now looking at all the participants. "My father was a teacher at a public school that was being pressured to pass students who hadn't learned the content because it improved the education department's statistics. He refused. He was persecuted, had his salary cut, but continued doing what was right. He said that integrity isn't something you have when it's convenient. It's something you choose, especially when it's inconvenient." Frank felt something tightening in his chest. It was the first time Josephine had spoken about her father with such depth, and each word revealed layers of strength and character he was just beginning to glimpse. "How touching," said Victoria, but her voice sounded less confident. "But we're talking about a real company, not a classroom. We're talking about real people," Josephine replied. "Real children who are exploited while we debate costs and benefits. If a company can only be profitable by exploiting the vulnerable, then maybe the problem isn't the cost of doing the right thing. Maybe it's the business model." When the exercise ended, Frank approached Josephine. She was gathering her materials, her hands trembling slightly, adrenaline from the confrontation still running through her veins. "You did very well," he said quietly. Josephine looked at him, surprised. "You think so? I felt like I talked too much." "You defended your convictions with intelligence and passion. There's nothing wrong with that." Victoria approached at that moment, her sharp smile still in place. "Josephine, dear, that was a very passionate presentation. Of course, when one has the luxury of not worrying about financial matters, it's easier to be idealistic." The implication was clear. Josephine could only have principles because she was married to a rich man. Frank saw Josephine's face pale, and something fierce awakened within him. "Victoria," his voice cut through the air like a blade, "I believe you have work waiting in your office." It was not a request. It was an order, given with all the CEO authority he rarely needed to use so directly. Victoria blinked, clearly surprised by the explicit protection Frank demonstrated for Josephine, but knew how to recognize when she had crossed a line. "Of course," she said, gathering her wounded dignity. "It was a pleasure getting to know you better, Josephine." When she left, Josephine turned to Frank. "You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied, surprising himself with the vehemence of his own response. "No one talks to you that way." There was something in Josephine's look that Frank could not decipher. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something that made his heart race. "Thank you," she said softly, "for defending me." That night, during dinner, the atmosphere between them had changed again. There was a new intimacy, forged by the moment when he had stood by her side. "May I ask a question?" said Josephine as they served dessert. "Of course. Why did you marry me? Really, why? Not your father's version about stability and convenience. Your version." Frank paused, considering the question. No one had asked this before. Not even he had deeply questioned his motivations. "Honestly," he said finally, "because it seemed safe. You weren't like the other women I had met. You didn't want anything from me beyond what was agreed upon. You wouldn't try to change me or make me promises of eternal love that we know don't exist." "And now," she asked softly, "do you still feel safe?" Frank looked at her. Really looked. He saw the strength she had demonstrated during the debate, the kindness she showed daily, the way she genuinely cared about the people around her. And he realized that no, he definitely did not feel safe anymore. "No," he admitted, his voice rougher than intended. "I don't feel safe at all." The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Josephine studied him with those brown eyes that seemed to see more than he would like to reveal. "Is that bad?" she asked. Frank considered the question for a long moment. I used to think so. Now, I'm not sure anymore. It was the most honest confession he had made in years, and they both knew it. Later that night, while Frank was working in his office, he heard a sound coming from the garden. Looking out the window, he saw Josephine sitting on the bench she had placed near the flowers she had planted, talking on the phone. Even from a distance, he could see she was crying. Without thinking twice, he went out to the garden. "Mom, I'm fine, I promise," Josephine was saying. "The treatment is working, that's what matters. No, he's kind to me, don't worry. I know you feel guilty, but you're not to blame for anything." When she saw Frank approaching, she quickly wiped away her tears. "Mom, I need to hang up now. I love you." "Is your mother okay?" asked Frank, sitting beside her on the bench. "Physically, yes. The treatment is responding better than we expected." Josephine looked at her hands. "But she feels guilty for me having married to save her. She says she ruined my chance of finding true love. And you? Do you feel that way?" Josephine was quiet for a long moment, watching the flowers she had planted sway gently in the night breeze. "I used to believe in fairy tales," she said finally. "Prince Charming, love at first sight, guaranteed happy endings. My father read stories to me every night when I was little." She smiled sadly. "But life taught me that sometimes you need to create your own happy ending, even if it's different from what you dreamed." "And what kind of happy ending would you create for yourself?" asked Frank, genuinely curious. Josephine looked at him, and there was something vulnerable and hopeful in her eyes. "One where I was loved for who I am, not for what I represent or what I can offer. One where I could love someone completely, without fear of being rejected for not being enough." She paused. "One where two people chose each other every day, not just once at the altar." Her words echoed in Frank's chest like a bell. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to be chosen every day by someone like Josephine. And more frightening still, what it would be like to choose her back. "Josephine," he began, but was interrupted by the sound of his phone ringing. It was a work emergency, a problem with an important project that required his immediate attention. When he finished the call, Josephine had already retired. In the following days, Frank found himself constantly thinking about the garden conversation. Josephine had painted a picture of love that was both simple and extraordinary, and he could not get it out of his head. But on the last day of the course, everything changed devastatingly. Frank had left a meeting early to arrive in time for the closing ceremony, when he heard voices coming from the break room near the training hall. One of them was unmistakably Victoria's. "Obviously, she's only here because she's the boss's wife, thinks she can play businesswoman because she married money." "That's kind of cruel, Victoria," said another voice that Frank recognized as Sarah, his assistant. "Cruel is reality, dear. Girls like her are a dime a dozen, pretty enough to trap a rich man, but without real substance. Frank will get tired of her in a few months, especially when he realizes she's just a country girl who knows how to pretend to be innocent." Frank felt anger rise like lava in his veins, but then he heard a third voice, one that made his blood freeze. "Maybe you're right." It was Josephine. "Maybe I really am just that." "Josephine!" Carla exclaimed, clearly not knowing she was listening. "No, it's okay." Josephine's voice was strangely calm. "It's good to know what people really think. Thank you for the honesty." Frank heard footsteps moving away quickly, Josephine fleeing, and then Sarah's furious voice. "Victoria, how could you? She heard everything." "Maybe it's better this way," Victoria replied without remorse. "Now she knows her place." Frank entered the break room at that moment, his expression so cold that Victoria immediately paled. "Mr. Frank, you're fired," he said with deadly calm. "Collect your things and leave the building. Now. You can't fire me for—" "I can, and I am. For creating a hostile work environment, for moral harassment of an employee, and for unprofessional conduct." His eyes were like ice. "And if I hear any rumors or malicious comments about my wife circulating around here, you'll discover that my influence in Colorado Springs' legal market is greater than you imagine." Victoria left furious, but Frank was already running after Josephine. He found her in the parking lot getting into a taxi. "Josephine, wait!" She turned and Frank saw she was crying, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of anger and humiliation. "You don't need to pretend you care," she said, her voice trembling. "I got the message." "What message?" "That he'll never be enough for this world, that no matter how hard I try, he'll always be just the country girl you married out of pity." "Josephine, that's not true." "Isn't it?" She stared at him. "Then tell me, Frank, have you ever seen me as more than a convenient arrangement? Have you ever looked at me and thought I could be worthy of true love, respect, partnership?" Frank remained silent. The words stuck in his throat. He wanted to say yes, that he had begun to see her completely differently, that she had turned his world upside down, but years of emotional self-discipline prevented him from being vulnerable at that crucial moment. The silence was the answer Josephine needed. "That's what I thought," she said, getting into the taxi. "Thank you for freeing me from the illusion." As the taxi drove away, Frank stood in the parking lot, feeling as if he had just lost something infinitely precious without even realizing he possessed it. And for the first time in his adult life, Frank Dixon felt completely lost. 3 weeks had passed since that day in the parking lot, and the mansion in Broadmoor had become a silent mausoleum. Josephine still lived there. Technically they were still married, but it was as if she were an elegant ghost floating through the rooms without leaving traces of her presence. She had stopped cooking, tending to the garden, trying to create any kind of domestic life. She greeted Frank politely in the morning, wished him good night when he arrived from work, and nothing more. It was exactly the type of relationship he had said he wanted at the beginning, but now her coldness was slowly killing him. Frank had tried to approach a few times, but Josephine had become an expert at leaving any room he entered, always with a polite excuse and a smile that did not reach her eyes. That Friday, he arrived home and found Mrs. Henderson tidying the living room with a worried expression. "Is she okay?" asked Frank, and they both knew who he was talking about. "Physically, yes," Mrs. Henderson replied carefully, "but if I may say, sir, she's dimmed, as if the light she had has gone out." Frank went up to his office but could not concentrate on work. Through the window he could see Josephine sitting in the garden, talking on the phone. Even from a distance, he could tell by her posture that something was wrong. When she hung up and buried her face in her hands, he did not hesitate. He ran down to the garden. "Josephine, what happened?" She raised her face and Frank saw she was crying. "My mother, she's fine, but—" Josephine swallowed hard. "Emma called. She said Mama has been crying every night since she found out about what happened at the course. She blames herself for me being unhappy. You told her about—" "Not the details, but she perceives something is wrong. Mothers always do." Josephine wiped away her tears. "Emma said she's been having nightmares about having ruined my life." Frank felt a sharp pain in his chest. "Josephine, I need to go visit her," said Josephine, standing up. "I need to show that I'm fine, that I'm happy, or she'll get sick again from guilt." "Of course. When do you want to go?" Josephine looked at him with surprise. "You would come with me?" "Of course I would. She's my mother-in-law." For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile appeared on Josephine's face. "Thank you. That would mean a lot to her. And to me." 2 days later, they were driving toward the Colorado mountains, to the small town where Josephine had grown up. Frank had insisted on driving personally, dismissing his driver, and during the 2-hour journey, they talked more than in the last 3 weeks combined. Josephine told stories about her childhood, about her teacher father, who had taught her to love books, about Emma and her mischief, about Scout and Daisy, and how they had appeared in her life as abandoned puppies. Frank found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks. "And you?" asked Josephine when they were arriving. "What was your childhood like?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "Lonely," he finally admitted. My father was always more interested in molding me to take over the business than in being a father. My mother died when I was 12, and after that, well, let's say affection wasn't abundant at home. Josephine studied him with new understanding. Is that why you're so afraid of getting close to people? The question caught him off guard with its surgical precision. Maybe. When they arrived at the simple but well-kept house where Josephine had grown up, Frank immediately understood where her quiet strength came from. Margaret Cooper, even clearly weakened by treatment, received them with warm dignity that reminded him of Josephine at her best moments. "Frank," she said, holding his hands with surprising firmness, "thank you for taking care of my girl." Frank looked at Josephine, who was playing with Scout and Daisy in the yard, laughing when they jumped around her as if she had never left. "Actually, Mrs. Cooper," he said softly, "I think she's the one who's been taking care of me." During lunch prepared by Emma, who observed Frank with poorly disguised curiosity, Frank saw Josephine in her natural element. She laughed easily, talked to everyone as if they were family, and there was a light in her eyes he had not seen in weeks. "She's different since she got married," commented Emma when Josephine and her mother went out to see the chickens in the yard. "More mature, but also more guarded, like she built a wall around her heart." "I know," said Frank, and there was genuine guilt in his voice. "Do you love her?" asked Emma directly, without beating around the bush. The question echoed in the silence of the small kitchen. Frank looked out the window, where Josephine was carefully holding a chicken, explaining something to her mother that made them laugh. "I'm beginning to realize I do," he admitted, the words coming out before he could censor them. "Then why do you both look like two people who missed the last train home?" Frank laughed sadly. "Because I'm an idiot who didn't know how to recognize a gift when I received it." "There's still time," said Emma, her tone gentler. "Josephine has a huge heart, but she also has pride. If you want a chance with her, you'll have to prove that you see her as she really is, not as a convenient arrangement." That night, Frank insisted they stay at the small-town hotel instead of returning the same day. During dinner at a simple but welcoming restaurant, he saw Josephine relax completely, for the first time since the course incident. "Thank you," she said when they were walking back to the hotel under the stars, "for coming, for being kind to my mother, for pretending we're a real couple." "I wasn't pretending," said Frank, stopping walking. Josephine turned to him, confusion in her eyes. "What?" "Today, seeing you with your family in your natural environment. I wasn't pretending anything. For the first time since we got married, I felt like I was where I should be." Tears appeared in Josephine's eyes. "Frank, don't do this. Don't give me hopes you'll destroy later." "What if I don't want to destroy them? What if I want to nurture them?" They were standing under a streetlight, and Frank could see every emotion passing across Josephine's face. Hope fighting against fear, desire against self-protection. "You said our marriage was just an arrangement," she said with a trembling voice, "that I wasn't your real wife." "I was wrong. About everything." Frank took a step toward her. "Josephine, I spent so much time trying not to feel anything that when I started feeling something for you, I panicked. But these last weeks without you were the worst of my life." "Frank, I love you," he said, the words coming out like a confession torn from his chest. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see the best in people. I love how you sing when you cook, how you talk to the garden plants, how you cried during that romantic movie we watched last week, thinking I didn't notice." Josephine was crying openly now. "You noticed? I notice everything about you, and I love everything I notice." He held her face between his hands. "Josephine, you made me want to be a better man. You made me want to feel again." "I love you too," she whispered. "Since the first day you laughed with me, since the first time you defended me, since you started seeing me as a real person." When Frank kissed her, under the stars of that small town, it was as if all the broken pieces of both of them finally fit together. It was soft and urgent at the same time, loaded with weeks of longing and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine. When they separated, Josephine smiled through her tears. "And now," said Frank, intertwining his fingers with hers, "we start over. The right way this time." They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, and for the first time since they had met, both felt they were exactly where they should be. Together, choosing each other not out of necessity or convenience, but out of love. But some new beginnings, they would discover, come with unexpected challenges. Epilogue. 2 years later, Frank's office on the top floor of the Dixon Real Estate Development Building was unrecognizable. Where there had once been only cold, modern furniture, now there were touches of warmth everywhere. A colorful blanket on the sofa that Josephine had knitted during winter, plants by the windows that she insisted needed natural light to be happy, and photographs of their family. Because yes, they had become a real family. Frank was reviewing the plans for his newest project when Josephine entered, carrying a bag and smiling in that way that still made his heart race 2 years later. "Real lunch," she announced, taking containers out of the bag. "No sandwiches wolfed down between meetings today." "You didn't need to come all the way up here," said Frank, but was already getting up to help her. "You could have asked someone to bring it." "I wanted to come up," replied Josephine, approaching to give him a quick kiss. "Besides, I have news." "Good news?" "The best." Josephine smiled, her eyes shining. "Emma is pregnant. She called me crying with happiness. She finally succeeded with Michael." Frank smiled, hugging her. In the last 2 years, he had become genuinely close to Josephine's family and friends. Emma and her husband regularly visited their house, and Frank had discovered he liked the warm chaos they brought. "And there's more," continued Josephine, her tone becoming more serious. "Mama wants to know if she can spend Christmas with us this year. The doctor said she's strong enough to travel." "Of course she can. This is her home too." Frank paused. "Actually, I was thinking, how about we build a house for her here in Colorado Springs? Close to ours, but independent. That way she can have privacy, but will be nearby if she needs anything." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. Even after all this time, she was still surprised by the generosity and care Frank showed toward her family. "You would do that?" "Josephine, your family is my family now. And besides," he smiled mischievously, "I need to keep my favorite mother-in-law happy." "She's your only mother-in-law, Frank. Still my favorite." While they had lunch, Josephine told him about her day. She had accepted a job as coordinator of social projects for the company, a position created especially for her, but which she had earned on her own merit, developing education and training programs for underprivileged communities. "How was the school visit today?" asked Frank. "Amazing! The children are already reading better, and the parents are enrolling in the vocational courses." Josephine glowed when she talked about her work. "There's a girl, Sophia, who reminds me of myself at her age, shy but with a thirst for learning that's beautiful to see." Frank watched Josephine's face as she spoke, still amazed at how she had transformed his life. The woman he had married as a convenient arrangement had become his anchor, his inspiration, his home. "Frank?" Josephine's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you okay? You got a strange expression." "Just thinking," he said, taking her hand. "Remember what you said that night in the garden about creating your own happy ending?" "I remember." "I think we did it." Josephine smiled, intertwining their fingers. "We really did, didn't we? Although it was different from any fairy tale I knew." "Better," said Frank, bringing her hand to his lips to kiss her fingers. "Because it's real." At that moment, Frank's phone rang. It was Sarah, his assistant. "Mr. Frank, sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Harold is here. He says it's important." Frank and Josephine exchanged glances. Mr. Harold rarely appeared at the office without warning, especially since Frank had made it clear he would not tolerate more interference in his marriage. "Send him in," said Frank, squeezing Josephine's hand to reassure her. Mr. Harold entered a few minutes later, and for the first time in a long time he seemed nervous. "Frank, Josephine," he greeted formally. "I apologize for interrupting, but I wanted to speak with you both personally." "About?" asked Frank, keeping his tone neutral. Mr. Harold took a deep breath. "I want to apologize. To both of you. Especially to you, Josephine." Josephine blinked, surprised. "Mr. Harold, let me finish, please." He turned to Frank. "I orchestrated that marriage thinking only of practical benefits. I thought I was being smart, solving two problems at once. But I never stopped to consider I was playing with two people's lives." He turned to Josephine. "And you, my dear, forgive me for having treated you like a piece in a chess game. You deserved better, and my son deserved the chance to choose for himself." "Dad," began Frank, but Mr. Harold raised his hand. "But then I saw you two together at the company party last month. I saw how you look at each other, how you compliment each other, how you choose each other every day. And I realized that by luck or destiny, my manipulation ended up resulting in something genuine and beautiful." Mr. Harold smiled for the first time since he had entered. "Josephine, thank you for saving my son from himself. And Frank, thank you for becoming the man I always knew you could be." Josephine stood up and, to everyone's surprise, hugged Mr. Harold. "Thank you for bringing me to him," she said softly, "even if for the wrong reasons." When Mr. Harold left, Frank and Josephine were alone again. Frank pulled Josephine onto his lap in the armchair, and she nestled against him naturally. "2 years," he murmured against her hair. "It feels like a lifetime, and at the same time, like it was yesterday." "I know," Josephine sighed contentedly. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real." "It's real," Frank assured, kissing her forehead. "And it will continue being real every day for the rest of our lives." Josephine pulled back to look into his eyes. "Frank Dixon, you're being romantic." "Josephine Dixon," he smiled, using her full name. "You taught me that being romantic isn't a weakness." She murmured, kissing him softly. "And you taught me it's possible to be loved exactly as I am." As the sun set over Colorado Springs, painting the sky pink and gold, Frank and Josephine remained embraced in the office that was no longer just a workplace, but one of the many places where they built their life together every day. Because some loves begin with convenient arrangements, but the best ones are those that grow through daily choices, mutual understanding, and the courage to be vulnerable with the right person. And Frank and Josephine discovered there was a unique beauty in a love that began practical and became magical, not despite its unusual origins, but because of them. They had learned that true love is not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone perfect for you, someone who sees you completely and chooses to stay, someone who transforms your fears into strengths and your wounds into wisdom. And as the city sparkled below, two hearts that began as strangers continued writing their own love story. One page at a time, one choice at a time, one eternal yes at a time.